The courtroom was heavy with tension, thick enough to make breathing feel like a task. My name is Evelyn Monroe, and as I stepped through those tall oak doors, every whisper died in the air. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Lawyers turned their heads. And my daughter-in-law, Melissa, smirked at my son as if victory already belonged to her. She didn't expect me to walk in. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders bent, hands gripping his wooden crutch. His once confident blue eyes looked dim under the harsh fluorescent light. When he saw me approach, he tried to stand, but I placed a steady hand on his arm. "Sit, son," I whispered. "You've done enough. Let me take it from here." At the judge's bench, the gavel rested silently. Judge Stephen Morales, a man with a reputation for calm authority, froze when his eyes met mine. His voice trembled almost imperceptibly as he said, "Mrs. Monroe, what brings you here?" The murmurs began again, growing like ripples on water. I heard a woman's voice near the back whisper, "That's her, the Iron Lady of Justice." The name I thought I had left behind years ago suddenly filled the room like a gust of wind. I walked to the defense table, my heels clicking against the wooden floor. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of defiance. My old leather briefcase, cracked, worn, but still strong, hit the table with a heavy thud. It wasn't just a bag. It carried my years, my scars, my fight. Melissa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her lips curled into a half-smile. She didn't know yet that the game she thought she had mastered was about to end. I looked straight at the judge, then at my son. Calmly, I said, "Your Honor, I am here to represent my son, Daniel Monroe." The courtroom fell silent again, the kind of silence that holds its breath before history changes. Before that day in court, life had been simple, humble but filled with love. Our small two-bedroom house on Maple Street wasn't much, but it was ours. My husband, Mark Monroe, used to sit on the porch every evening, tapping his fingers on his coffee mug while Daniel kicked a soccer ball across the front yard. I remember thinking, this is what happiness looks like. Quiet, ordinary, safe, but happiness can vanish in a single breath. One night when Daniel was 10, Mark put down his fork at dinner and said without a trace of emotion, "Evelyn, I'm leaving. I've met someone else." The clatter of his knife against the plate was the last sound before silence swallowed the room. He walked out with a packed suitcase waiting by the door as if he had rehearsed this moment long before. Daniel ran to the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, watching the headlights disappear into the night. I stood frozen at the table, a spoon still in my hand, unable to cry, unable to scream. When I finally turned to my son, his eyes were red and lost. "Mom," he whispered, "why did Dad leave us?" I pulled him into my arms. "I don't know, honey," I said softly. "But I promise you this, you and I will never be alone." And I kept that promise. The years that followed were merciless. I worked 2 jobs, secretary by day and bookkeeper by night. I would come home past midnight, slip off my shoes quietly, and walk through the dark hallway just to check Daniel's homework before finally washing the dishes he had left in the sink. He always left 1 or 2 there on purpose just to make me smile. We didn't have vacations or fancy dinners. We didn't have new clothes every year or expensive toys, but we had laughter, and we had each other. Some nights Daniel would sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I balanced ledgers beside him. The small yellow lamp between us cast a warm glow over our tired faces. "Mom," he once said, looking up from his math book, "when I grow up, I'm going to take care of you." I smiled and brushed his hair back. "You don't have to take care of me," I told him softly. "Just live a good life." But deep down, I knew he meant every word. Years passed faster than I expected. The little boy who used to kick a soccer ball across the yard slowly became a young man with quiet determination in his eyes. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. Daniel opened it at the kitchen table while I stood beside him, drying my hands on a dish towel. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom, I got in." My heart skipped. "Got in where?" "The University of Illinois," he whispered. "Electrical engineering." The acceptance letter trembled in my hands as I read it. For the first time in years, tears rolled down my face. Not tears of pain, tears of pride. That night after Daniel went to bed, I opened my jewelry box and stared at the one thing I had kept from my old life, my wedding ring. The next morning, I walked into a small pawn shop downtown. The clerk placed the ring on a scale and watched the numbers settle. I watched too, but I wasn't thinking about gold or money. I was thinking about Daniel's future. When the clerk handed me the cash, I closed my hand around it tightly. That was the day I traded my past for my son's future, and I would do it again 1,000 times. Years later, Daniel graduated with honors. The day he walked across the stage in his black cap and gown, I sat in the audience gripping my purse so tightly my knuckles turned white. When they called his name, Daniel Monroe, Bachelor of Electrical Engineering, the entire world seemed to stop. I clapped harder than anyone in that auditorium, not because of the diploma, but because every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every tear had led to that moment. After graduation, Daniel moved to Chicago and found a job with a growing construction firm that specialized in electrical systems for large buildings. He called me the day he signed his first major contract. "Mom," he said, his voice bursting with excitement, "I'm going to build us a house." I laughed softly. "You don't have to do that, sweetheart." "Yes, I do," he insisted. "No more renting, no more moving around. I want you to have a home that no one can ever take away." Daniel worked harder than I had ever seen anyone work. Long hours, weekend shifts. Sometimes he skipped meals just to save money faster. Every dollar went into that dream. 2 years later, he called me again. "Mom," he said quietly, "it's ready." When I arrived at the edge of the city, he was standing in front of a modest 2-story house with light gray siding and a small white porch. It wasn't a mansion, but to us it felt like a palace. Daniel walked up the front steps and held out a small set of keys. "They're yours," he said. My hands trembled as I took them. "No more rented rooms," he whispered. "No more landlords, this is our home." I stepped through the doorway slowly, touching the wooden frame. The house smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. In that moment, I felt the heartbeat of every sacrifice that had brought us there. And for a while, everything felt right again. A year later, Daniel met Melissa. She was bright and charming, with soft brown hair and a laugh that seemed to fill every room. The first time Daniel introduced us, she hugged me warmly. "I've heard so much about you," she said. "Daniel says you're the strongest woman he knows." At first, I believed she truly loved him. She made him smile again, and after everything he had been through, that was all I wanted. They married the following spring under the old oak tree behind the house. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, and Daniel's eyes were filled with hope. I remember standing beside them, whispering quietly to myself, maybe this is the happy ending we both deserve. For a while, it seemed like it was. But life had other plans. 2 years into Daniel and Melissa's marriage, life changed in a single moment. Daniel's construction firm had assigned him to supervise an electrical installation at a high-rise project on the outskirts of Chicago. It was the kind of job he had dreamed about, big, complex, and important. That evening, I was standing in the kitchen washing dishes when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was shaky. "Mrs. Monroe, there's been an accident." My heart stopped. "Your son fell at the construction site. He's alive, but it's serious." The glass slipped from my hand and shattered across the kitchen floor. The world tilted. I don't even remember the drive to the hospital. When I arrived, Daniel lay in a narrow hospital bed surrounded by machines. White bandages wrapped around his body and tubes snaked across the blankets. The steady beep of the monitor felt like a knife piercing my chest with every sound. The doctor pulled me aside. "He's lucky to be alive," he said gently, "but the fall damaged his leg badly. Even after surgery, he may never walk normally again." I nodded slowly, but inside I felt something break. When Daniel finally opened his eyes, they were clouded with pain and confusion. I took his hand and leaned close. "I'm here," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." And I meant every word. Even if the world turned its back on him, I never would. At first, Melissa seemed devoted. She stayed beside Daniel's hospital bed. She fed him soup, held his hand, and told him everything would be okay. "Don't worry," she said to me more than once. "I'll take care of him. I love him no matter what." For a while, I believed her. But love sometimes changes when life becomes inconvenient. When Daniel was finally discharged from the hospital, his recovery was slow and painful. He walked with a crutch now. Every step looked like it cost him strength. I rearranged the living room so he could move around the house more easily. I installed railings along the hallway and moved furniture to create wider paths. Melissa helped at first, but little by little, her patience faded. She rolled her eyes when Daniel asked for help reaching something. She sighed loudly whenever therapy bills arrived in the mail. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she stared at Daniel's crutch with quiet irritation. One morning, I overheard her talking on the phone in the kitchen. She thought I was still upstairs. "I can't live like this forever," she whispered sharply. There was a pause, then she said the words that made my blood run cold. "Once the house is split, I'll have enough to start over." Split the house? The home Daniel had built with his own hands. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. I wanted to storm into the kitchen and demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped back quietly. I had spent too many years around courtrooms not to recognize the sound of greed disguised as justification. From that day forward, I watched her carefully, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. From that day forward, I watched Melissa carefully, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. Her modest clothes slowly disappeared from the closet, replaced by designer dresses and expensive shoes. New perfume bottles appeared on the bathroom counter. Handbags that cost more than a month of groceries began hanging by the door. At first, Daniel didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't want to. Melissa began going out more often at night. She said she needed time to clear her head, time to breathe after caring for Daniel all day. But something about the way she said it always felt rehearsed. The house that had once been filled with laughter slowly changed. Dinner conversations became short and awkward. The kitchen, once the warm heart of our home, now felt cold and tense. The sound that replaced laughter was the sharp click of Melissa's high heels crossing the hardwood floor as she walked toward the door. Every night, Daniel still looked at her with the same tenderness he always had. He refused to see what was right in front of him, but I saw it, every glance she gave the house. Every calculating look at the walls Daniel had built with his own hands. I knew she wasn't just planning to leave him, she was planning to take everything he had left. There was only one light left in Daniel's life, his daughter Lily. She was 8 years old, with freckles sprinkled across her nose and a smile bright enough to chase away even the darkest days. Every afternoon, she sat beside her father on the porch, drawing pictures while he told her stories about the house. "This wall," he would say, tapping the wooden siding, "I built with my own hands, sweetheart." Lily would giggle and run her fingers along the wood grain. "Then this house is magic," she would say. Daniel would laugh. For those moments, everything felt normal again, but even that small joy didn't last. One night, I woke up thirsty and walked downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed Lily's bedroom, I heard voices inside. Melissa's voice, sharp. "Urgent? Lily, listen carefully," she said. My footsteps stopped outside the door. "Tomorrow, when the judge asks you, you tell him you don't want to live with Daddy." My heart stopped. "And you say Grandma makes you uncomfortable. Understand?" There was a long silence, then Lily's small voice trembled through the door. "But Mom, I love Daddy and Grandma." My chest tightened. "I don't want to lie." Melissa's voice grew colder. "If you don't do what I say, we'll lose everything." Her tone hardened. "Do you want to live in this broken house forever? Do you want to end up poor like them?" I pressed my back against the wall. My knees felt weak. I had seen cruelty in courtrooms. I had watched people lie under oath without blinking. But hearing those words come from a mother to her own child was something else entirely. Inside the room, Lily began to cry softly. "Please don't make me do it, Mommy." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room listening to the old clock tick on the wall. Each second echoed like a decision being made. This was no longer just about money. Melissa wasn't just trying to take Daniel's house, she was trying to break his heart. And worse, she was trying to twist an innocent child's truth into a lie. That was something I would never allow. And in that silent room, I made a decision. The Iron Lady of Justice was about to return. The next morning, I knew exactly what had to be done. Anger wouldn't win this battle, tears wouldn't either. What I needed was truth and proof. Years ago, I had spent enough time around courtrooms to understand one simple rule: justice belongs to the person who comes prepared. It was time to remember who I used to be before life turned me into just someone's mother. I drove downtown to a narrow alley just off Michigan Avenue. At the end of the street stood a small, weathered office building that smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. The faded sign on the door read, "Robert Harris, a private investigator." Robert and I had worked together years ago during my legal career, back when reporters still called me the Iron Lady of Justice. When I pushed open the door, a bell jingled overhead. Robert looked up from his desk, nearly spilling his coffee. For a moment, he just stared. "Evelyn Monroe," he said, blinking in disbelief. "I thought you retired from this life." "I did," I answered calmly. "But someone's threatening my son and my granddaughter." His expression grew serious instantly. "Sit down," he said. I told him everything: Daniel's accident, Melissa's sudden change, the way she had begun talking about splitting the house. And finally, what I had heard outside Lily's bedroom door. Robert leaned back slowly in his chair, rubbing his chin. "That's ugly," he muttered. Then he asked a question that made my stomach tight. "Do you think she's seeing someone else?" I nodded. "I don't have proof," I said, "but my instincts say yes." Robert gave a slow, knowing smile. "Instincts are usually right." He stood up and grabbed his coat. "Give me a few days," he said quietly. "I'll find out who he is." 3 days later, we met in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Chicago. Robert arrived carrying a small brown envelope. The look in his eyes told me everything before he even spoke. "This isn't pretty," he said, sliding the envelope across the table. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were photographs and financial reports. "There's a man named William Grant," Robert explained. "A real estate mogul, married, wealthy, and not exactly known for his honesty." He tapped one of the photographs. Melissa stood outside a luxury hotel wearing a red dress. Beside her was a tall, gray-haired man stepping out of a black car. They were laughing, comfortable, too comfortable. "Lincoln Hotel," Robert continued. "Every Thursday night, same room. Same routine." Each photograph felt like another knife twisting deeper, but I didn't look away. I had seen enough betrayal in my life to recognize it when it stared me in the face. This wasn't love, this was greed. Melissa had already decided to abandon Daniel, but before she left, she wanted his house, his money, his daughter, everything. I closed the envelope slowly and looked up at Robert. "Thank you," I said quietly. He studied my face carefully. "You're not planning something reckless, are you?" I shook my head. "No." Then I allowed myself the faintest smile. "I'm planning something legal." That night, I sat alone in my room. On the table in front of me rested my old leather briefcase. The same one I had carried into courtrooms for nearly 20 years. Its edges were worn, the handle cracked with age, but it was still strong, just like the woman who owned it. I ran my fingers slowly across the leather. Tomorrow I would open it again, not for fame, not for revenge, but for justice. And when the courtroom doors opened, the Iron Lady would walk in once more. The morning of the trial arrived under a sky the color of steel. I helped Daniel out of the car, steadying him as he leaned on his crutch. Across the courthouse steps, cameras flashed and reporters whispered to each other. They weren't there for Daniel, they were there for me. Word had spread quickly that the Iron Lady of Justice was returning to the courtroom after more than 20 years. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Every bench was filled. People even stood along the marble walls, waiting to see what would happen. Daniel sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, adjusting his papers with trembling hands. I placed my old briefcase beside him. "Breathe, son," I whispered gently. "Let me handle the rest." A few minutes later, Melissa entered. She wore a fitted emerald dress. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her lips carried the confident smile of someone who believed victory was already hers. Her lawyer, Jennifer Cross, walked beside her, sharp-eyed and polished. She had the reputation of being the kind of attorney who cared more about winning than about being right. They sat across from us. Melissa didn't even glance at Daniel. She simply crossed her legs and looked around the courtroom like a queen surveying her kingdom. A moment later, Judge Stephen Morales entered. The room rose to its feet. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and tapped the gavel lightly. "Let's proceed." Jennifer Cross stood first. Her voice was smooth and confident. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Melissa Monroe, has endured years of hardship caring for her disabled husband. She now seeks fair compensation, half ownership of the shared home, and primary custody of their daughter." Every word felt like a dagger aimed at Daniel, but I remained silent. When she finished speaking, I rose slowly. The courtroom fell quiet as every eye followed me. "Your Honor," I began calmly, "the house in question was purchased solely by Daniel Monroe 2 years before his marriage." I handed a set of documents to the clerk. "The property records, mortgage agreements, and payment history clearly confirm this." Gasps spread through the room. Judge Morales scanned the documents carefully, then raised his eyebrows slightly. Across the room, Jennifer Cross shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but I wasn't finished. "There is more, Your Honor." I nodded to the clerk, who inserted a small USB drive into the courtroom speaker system. A familiar voice filled the room, Melissa's voice. "Lily, remember what I told you. Say you don't want to live with Daddy. Say Grandma scares you." Then came Lily's small voice. "But I love Daddy. I don't want to lie." The courtroom fell completely silent. Melissa suddenly jumped to her feet. "That's fake," she shouted. "She's lying." Judge Morales raised his hand sharply. "Order in the court." He looked toward the bailiff. "Bring the child in." When Lily entered the courtroom, her tiny frame seemed almost lost in the large wooden space. She clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. The judge softened his voice. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "tell me something." Lily climbed onto the witness chair, her feet dangling above the floor. "Where do you want to live?" Lily wiped her tears. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "With my daddy and grandma." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the room. "Because they tell the truth." Someone in the back quietly clapped before being hushed. Daniel buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I placed my hand gently on his back. Melissa looked like the ground beneath her had disappeared. Her lawyer stared down at the table, already realizing the case was lost. I stood once more and spoke calmly. "Your Honor, the truth doesn't need permission to speak. It only needs courage." And in that moment, justice began to breathe again. The following week, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. People filled every bench, and many stood along the walls, whispering quietly while reporters prepared their notebooks. The tension in the room felt almost electric. Daniel sat beside me, his crutch resting against the table. I could feel the nervous tremble in his hand as he gripped the edge of the desk. I gently placed my hand over his. "It's going to be okay," I whispered. A moment later, Judge Stephen Morales entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. The room fell silent as he took his seat and adjusted the papers in front of him. His expression was calm, but there was a gravity in his eyes that told us the moment had arrived. He cleared his throat and began. "After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and recordings presented to this court, the ruling is as follows." Every breath in the courtroom seemed to stop. "The property in question was purchased by Mr. Daniel Monroe prior to his marriage. Therefore, the house remains solely his property." A ripple of gasps spread through the room. Melissa's face drained of color. Her lawyer lowered her eyes, already accepting defeat, but the judge wasn't finished. He looked down at the next page and continued. "The court also finds evidence of coercion and emotional manipulation involving the minor child." The room grew even quieter. "For this reason, sole custody of Lily Monroe is granted to Mr. Daniel Monroe." Daniel's hand tightened in mine. "And Mrs. Evelyn Monroe is recognized as her primary guardian alongside him." Melissa's chair scraped slightly against the floor as she shifted in disbelief. Judge Morales finished the ruling. "Mrs. Melissa Monroe shall receive no financial compensation from the property. Visitation with the child will only be permitted under supervised conditions." Then the gavel struck the bench. The sound echoed like thunder through the courtroom. For a moment there was complete silence. Then quiet applause began to rise from the back rows, not loud, but heartfelt. Daniel turned to me, tears streaming down his face. "Mom, we did it." His voice broke as he pulled me into an embrace. At that moment, Lily ran across the room and wrapped her small arms around both of us. "Daddy, Grandma," she was crying too. "We're staying together." I held them both tightly. For the first time in months, the weight pressing on my chest finally lifted. The house Daniel built, the house filled with every sacrifice and memory, was safe again. Justice had spoken. And this time it spoke the truth.